Chapter 13 Dubious Hospitality. Hilda and Paul were the first who uttered a sound. Automatically, at this sight of Hebe asleep, they put their hands to their lips to indicate perfect silence. Then almost in a breath they whispered, "Shh, shh," and began backing away. Miss Grant, however, had no compunction whatever about disturbing the sleeper. "Nonsense," she said, in her natural tones. "This is the best possible place for us to have a luncheon. I intended it here all along. She'll have to wake up." She signed to the boys to put down the baskets they were carrying, and herself deposited her sweater and a big box of chocolates near Hebe's head. Hebe woke, of course, and turned slowly, opening her eyes. For a second she made no move to rise, but lay, blinking a little, her eyes dark with sleep. But then she did move, sitting up, leaning her back against the rock. She surveyed the interested group. "Oh dear," she said, but with no special emphasis, "I forgot all about this party. I'd have gone another walk if I'd remembered." Miss Grant's response to that was, in her sweetest and most polite tone, a tone, by the way, which she would not have dreamed of using to a friend or to anyone who might have been a friend. It was reserved for such irritating public servants as tardy postmen or rude ticket agents, and for her own servants sometimes, but only when they had been most stupid. She said, "So sorry, but this is the place we always spread our luncheon. I am going to have the baskets undone in the exact spot you are occupying, if you don't mind." Hebe rose. "Oh, certainly. I didn't even hear you coming. I was asleep, you see." No one else, surely, could rise as Hebe rose from a sitting position on the ground. She had not touched the stone with even the tips of her fingers. She rose as easily as a grass blade rises from the light tread of a big bee. Even Miss Grant noticed her peculiar lightness, yet her expression was not one of applause. She said, "Don't apologize. It's perfectly all right." But Hebe had not been meaning to apologize. She looked at Miss Grant to say so. Miss Grant, however, had turned a shoulder and was gazing at the view, waiting for the intruder to go. She looked at the view, but she tapped the granite under her with one foot, nervously, impatiently. Hebe noticed the uneasy foot. Crystal held out her hand to Hebe. "Oh, Hebe," she said, "I wanted to bring you to Hunter's Beach myself, but I thought it too long a walk. Now you've done it alone." Hebe took the hand briefly. "Hello, Hilda and Paul," she said to the two who were standing silent, waiting with the others for her departure, it seemed. "Paul, give me your shoulder down. I'm stiff from the rock." You wouldn't have guessed that from the way she had risen from the rock. Paul refused his shoulder. "Oh no, Hebe. Stay and have lunch with us now. You're here," he said hurriedly. "It's a dreadfully long walk back. We can crowd you in, or I'll walk myself." "Please stay," Hilda echoed. Crystal wanted to add her voice to the invitation too, of course, but how could she when it was not her party? Hebe hesitated, considering. Then she looked at Miss Grant. Miss Grant is your hostess. Really, you're not at liberty to invite me, she said. A pause followed, with Paul still silently refusing his shoulder. Then Miss Grant said shortly, with little enthusiasm discernible in her voice, "The picnic is really in honor of Paul and Hilda. Any one they care to add to it is of course welcome, though I shall refuse to let either of them walk back naturally." "Very well," Hebe said. "I'll stay then. I didn't know I'd be so hungry. I didn't expect to be hungry at all. But it is a much longer walk than I thought. Thank you, Miss Grant." Crystal thought to herself that if she were Hebe, she would never have stayed, being asked in that tone. It hurt her that her friend had not understood how unpleasant Miss Grant had really meant to be, and refused firmly, for Crystal had no doubt that no matter how tired Hebe was, or how hungry, if she had only realized Miss Grant's rudeness, she would have gone right away. All her pride was in arms for Hebe now, Hebe, who was too lovely herself to recognize unloveliness in others. There was only one thing Crystal could do to help the situation, and that she did with her whole heart. She devoted herself to Hebe, for she was afraid the others would pay very little attention to her. "Have you seen these bluebells?" she asked, just touching her friend's hand to make her look. Hebe bent with her at the edge of the cliff. The bluebells were flung there like an airy banner against the perpendicular of the rock. "Yes, I was looking at them before I went to sleep. I remembered your doorstep with the bluebells growing in the crack. The others at their backs were talking and laughing and paying no attention. So Crystal asked a question. 'Do you see the flowers grow, Hebe? I've sometimes wondered if you didn't.' The question, in spite of its queerness, did not surprise Hebe, but she looked at Crystal a little strangely before answering. It was a questioning look, of swift interest. "Yes, I almost think I do," she responded, "sometimes. Do you?" "Oh, no, but I can imagine you're seeing them." "Why?" "Because you have that sort of a look." At this instant, Miss Grant's voice came to them so sharply that Crystal jumped. Hebe would have jumped too, but she was not a jumping person. "Do you mind helping us with the lunch, Hebe? We are opening the baskets." It was put in the form of a question, but its tone made it a command. Hebe turned from the bluebells. "Oh, certainly," she said, in a polite but absent-minded way. "We ought to have been helping all the time, Crystal." "Well, no, I don't think Crystal will be needed." Miss Grant answered that. "She'll come with us for a short walk along the cliffs. Hilda's never been, and it will help appetites. After your own long walk, however, you'll hardly need that stimulation. You will be so kind as to spread the things on this table-like place while we're gone." Here are paper plates for the salad. There are sandwiches. Leave the cake, I'll cut it. But those deviled eggs must all be unwrapped. It was very cool of Miss Grant, really, but she felt herself justified. If this person was to eat of their luncheon, she might as well be made some use of. And besides, Miss Grant had not believed Hebe when she said she had forgotten that the party was to be in this spot today. Miss Grant was perfectly convinced that the queer person had meant to be discovered here and get herself invited all along. Well, with children like Paul and Hilda, she might work such tricks, but she would find she had an adult and a woman of the world to deal with in herself. Hebe was very docile, so docile in fact that for a fleeting instant Miss Grant had a qualm, but it vanished at once. She was sure that she was doing exactly right. Hilda was plainly uneasy. Why can't we all get the lunch ready and then go along the cliff, she asked, reasonably. Or do it when we come back. This is leaving it all on Hebe. Miss Grant was annoyed, but she said, in an offhand manner, "Oh, Hebe is glad to help. Aren't you, Hebe?" Hebe nodded. Already she was busy with the little parcels of sandwiches, so neatly folded in squares of oiled paper. "Shall I mix the different kinds, or keep them separated?" she asked of Miss Grant. Better keep them separated. So it was really all right about Hebe, and the walkers started off, but Crystal remained behind with Hebe. The poppy color in her cheeks was not whipped there by sea wind. She began undoing the sandwich packages. Hebe protested. "Run along with the others," she said. "Do, Crystal." Crystal shook her head. She could not say anything. She was too angry for her friend's sake. She did not want Hebe to guess that she was angry. She did not want Hebe to wake up to the fact that she was being put upon. Her excitement, strangely, was making her unusually efficient with the delicate packages. Hebe was much less so with hers. That was because she was abstracted. Before they turned the point of rock that would take them from sight, the walkers missed Crystal and stood calling her, but she signed to them most emphatically that she was not coming. When they had gone on and disappeared, Hebe stopped work altogether. She folded her hands and looked at Crystal with seriousness. "This won't do, my dear," she said. "You must go on with the others now. The picnic must not be spoiled for you. I would never have stayed to do that." Crystal laughed. Yes, she managed to laugh in spite of the poppies in her cheeks. "How could that spoil anything for me, staying with you instead of going with them?" she asked. It couldn't. Her complete conviction in this made Hebe even more thoughtful. She replied, "It hadn't occurred to me before, but our growing friendship, Crystal, may not be a good thing. It may make criticism, and you'll be bothered, as now." "You're strange, Hebe. I thought you the wisest person I knew. Yes, wiser than Dr. Grant, who's wiser than most anybody. But you were wise in a new way, and now suddenly you aren't wise. You couldn't say such things if you were." If Crystal had been a little in awe of Hebe from the very first encounter with her, in this instant Hebe was more in awe of Crystal. She argued no more, and turned to the task at hand. They worked quickly and silently, each occupied with her own thinking, and soon they were finished with the work Miss Grant had outlined. "It's a nice luncheon your hostess has planned for you," Hebe observed, sitting back and surveying the rock table. "It's very kind of her. She is doing a lot for Hilda and Paul. Hilda likes her ever so much, Paul too." Hebe picked up a graham sandwich and squinted at it, scrutinizing the filling. "This looks like olive and nuts," she observed. "I simply must eat it. You have one too. That one there's a fig, and that honey." Crystal refused to take a sandwich, but that did not deter Hebe. She ate the olive and nut, enjoying it. "The laborer is worthy of his hire," she quoted, meeting Crystal's slightly scandalized gaze. And that was the minute, of course, that Miss Grant chose to appear. She had outwalked the others a little, and came around the rocks at their backs quite suddenly. She noticed at once the half-eaten sandwich in Hebe's hands. She looked her surprise, but said nothing. Crystal's poppies grew in depth of color. Why, oh why had Hebe? But since she had, Crystal sincerely wished that she too might have been discovered eating a sandwich. Miss Grant's silent criticism would have had two victims then, and so perhaps have not fallen so heavily on the one. But for all Crystal's color, Hebe herself stayed pale and cool, the ivory tint of her face accentuated by the shadow her wide hat lent. She had put on the hat as soon as she waked. "I must apologize for not waiting," she told Miss Grant, but she was looking at Crystal's poppies and the liquid blackness that had invaded Crystal's usually clear amber eyes. "You shouldn't have such marvelous food if one is to resist. Did you make them?" Miss Grant came near to snorting. Only good breeding restrained her. "No," she said, in a tone sweeter even than that she had used in her first encounter with Hebe. "My cook made them. Do you know her, Margaret Murphy?" Hebe considered. "Yes, I believe I do. She comes up to the Red House to see us sometimes. She's like an Irish rose, but she's as good a cook as she's a pretty girl, isn't she?" Miss Grant had nothing to say to these compliments for Margaret Murphy. Besides, the others had now arrived. Hebe smiled at them all, her peculiar, delicate smile. She had finished her sandwich, and she stood up. "I'm going now," she told them. "I really wasn't as hungry as I thought. One sandwich quite satisfied it anyway. Thank you for that, Miss Grant, and goodbye." This was the first time Miss Grant had ever seen the smile, and perhaps the first time she had met Hebe's eyes in just that way. For a flash she caught, though ever so fleetingly, Hebe's charm. "Oh, don't go." Her lips had spoken it before her mind had thought it seemed. She added to that as a balance. "Besides, you'll be a decided help after lunch. You can pack up while we all scramble down to the beach." But this was too much for Hebe. She put up her hands, warding off the idea. "Oh, really, I couldn't do that," she protested. Is there anything in life more hateful than picking up after a picnic lunch? Do you know anything worse yourself, Miss Grant? The only way to manage it is for everyone to clench his teeth and pitch in together. She stepped to the ledge above. Looking down at them, she said again, "Thank you for your hospitality. Goodbye." She was gone, walking along the cliff's edge like a moving bar of light, Crystal thought. Her white scarf caught some reflection from the sky or sea and made her seem almost transparent as she went. Light was the word for it. Light moving along the cliff's edge. "Oh, she's gone," Hilda said worriedly, "and it's such a long way home." But Paul laughed. "We couldn't stop her, you know," he said. "She does what she wants to always. No one's so stubborn." "Paul Gildersleeve, will you shut up?" Hilda looked furious. Crystal's heart beat for her. Hilda was certainly an ally, but in spite of Hilda's fury, Paul would go on laughing. He broke out into a laugh several times during the meal, and most of the time, between mouthfuls, he wore a grin. When lunch was finished, they did the picking up determinedly and in unison, as Hebe had suggested they should. Then they all climbed down to the white beach below to look in at the caves, at the cliff's foot. The tide was steadily going out, making the excursion possible. Later, they gathered in the high protected spot they had first chosen, and Miss Grant, sitting in the place where Hebe had slept, read to them from a book of Sherlock Holmes stories. Crystal sat looking off to sea, not listening to the reading. She was wondering how far Hebe had got by now on that long cross-country walk home. She wondered, too, what Bianca would have done if she had seen how rudely Miss Grant had treated Hebe after inviting her to stay. Crystal by now had seen enough of Bianca to know that she behaved toward Hebe as though Hebe were her queen, as well as her best friend. Crystal never marveled at this. It was sensible in Bianca to feel so. It would be sensible to anyone to feel so, Crystal considered. It was odd the way the white scarf had caught the light as she went away from them along the cliff's edge. Part 3. The White Dragon. Chapter 14. A Feather in Her Cap. Hilda and Crystal were sitting together the afternoon following the Hunter's Beach picnic on a window seat near the rehearsal room. Crystal waiting her cue, and Hilda merely idling. This was one of the few windows in the red house that really had a view of the sea. Today it was windy out there. A few sails, stuck up like quills against the indigo, rivaled the whitecaps for brilliance. "Hickory-crickory, wouldn't it be great sailing today?" Hilda exclaimed enviously. She often used such expletives, and Crystal had quite got over noticing. "Mother says next summer we can have a yawl if we come back here." Crystal looked at Hilda hopefully. Was she really going to talk about Victoria Gildersleeve at last? "Does your mother like sailing?" she asked. "You bet she does. That's why we can't do it this summer, I guess. Too much of a temptation. It takes too much of her mind, she says. But since she's not here, she wouldn't be tempted. Or is she coming later? Hilda looked so annoyed at the innocent remark and the question that Cristel covered them up with other questions. Was Hebe tired last night after that long walk, she asked, and wasn't Miss Grant horrid? Surely here she was on safe ground. Hilda had proved herself an ally more than once where Hebe was concerned, but Cristel was dismayed to see Hilda's annoyance only deepen, or was it merely embarrassment? At any rate, she looked very queer, and her freckles dimmed in the rush of color to her face. She didn't say she was tired, and of course Miss Grant isn't horrid. She's a peach of a mother, I think, and Dr. Grant too. He's corking. It's a jolly family. I only meant horrid to Hebe. I thought you cared about that too. Of course Dr. Grant is splendid. I know that as well as you do. And Agnes has been my best friend for 3 years, and Miss Grant is Selina's. Why say such things then? They were beginning to sound very pettish. Cristel sighed. When I like people awfully, I get mad when other people are horrid to them, that's all. I thought you understood yesterday. You told Paul to shut up. Well, let's not fight over it. If Hebe minded herself, I'd mind too, Hilda said, conciliatory. But she doesn't mind a bit, and she thinks Miss Grant is a very pleasant and kind person. She said so last night. Say, do you think we could get that friend of yours, Alexander Coldwater, to help with the stage sets? There's not so much time left. We got a letter from Father this morning. He wants to come August 10th for 2 days. He's to be in the East for a whole week, but most of it has got to be spent in New York. He's going to be some surprised at this production. We've never done anything so well. That's because you're all so interested. Isn't Agnes a peach of a Juliet? Paul thinks so. Out of all this, Cristel extracted the one question about Alexander to answer. Why don't you get Hebe to ask him, she said. All he cares about is painting, and he won't even stay at Blue Diamond to help his grandmother entertain the French ambassador. But he might help us if Hebe asked him. Oh, Hebe, she doesn't want anything to do with the play. She's keeping quite out of it. It's more fun that way too for Paul. You ask Alexander today. Won't you be seeing him? This was very puzzling. Did or did not Hilda like Hebe, and why was it more fun for Paul if Hebe kept out of things? If Cristel had been anyone else but Cristel, she would almost surely have put all the twos and twos together that had come her way and made enough fours to see light with before now. But Cristel's mind, while good enough for its own purposes, was peculiarly inactive in some directions. It was curiously incurious. So now she simply said, putting aside her flicker of wonder, All right, then, I'll ask Alexander. What do you want him to do exactly? It would be just too gorgeous if he'd paint us some real sets. The street scene, to stand right up against the house, and the friar's cell. There's only a little over 2 weeks, though, if father's to see the play, and of course he must see it. Aren't you lunching at Blue Diamond tomorrow yourself? Crystal asked. You and Paul. Why don't you both ask him then? Because we've had lunch there twice before, and he hasn't come to it. His place was set and everything. Madame Coldwater said he'd probably got interested in a picture and couldn't leave it. She didn't seem to mind, but she was a little sarcastic. She said his pictures were unspeakably absurd, that she didn't know what his father was going to make of him, that he might refuse to help him altogether when he saw what his summer's work had been. She talks along awfully frankly, doesn't she? And yet you never think it's queer in her. I like her, but she scares me. Does she you? No, since I don't know her, she doesn't scare me when she passes in her car, which is the only way I ever see her, or in church. But she does stare at me as though she'd like to scare me, and puts up her lorgnette. I can't imagine going to lunch with her alone, as you and Paul do. I'd be scared then. All right. I know I'd do everything wrong, and Miss Grant says when people do things wrong, she never gets over it. Hilda laughed. I should say. Even Paul's on his good behavior with her. He opens doors for her, pulls back her chair, and always remembers to walk behind. How she manages to make him do such things I don't see. He says she doesn't do anything about it. He just remembers automatically when she's about, that's all. But when a person can make Paul remember such things. All this conversation in the window seat, so near the rehearsal, had been going on only because Paul was so entirely absorbed in bullying Agnes through the poison scene. But now he roared out at them. Quiet out there. Shh, shh. He detested conversation at rehearsals, and managed to keep all his actors as quiet as though they were in school. Hilda made a face now, a humorous one, and vanished out over the window-sill. She was a tomboy, and fearless, and from the very first day here had come and gone from story to story of the Red House, by way of window ledges, balcony rails, and tree limbs. In a game of Follow My Leader, most of the boys even would have fallen behind if Hilda should be leader and start to climb. Crystal did not agree with Hilda that Agnes was making a peach of a Juliet. Agnes would never satisfy her. No one really could, perhaps, but Victoria Gildersleeve herself. Oh, how she wished she, like Agnes and Esther this October, was to see Victoria Gildersleeve playing Juliet in New York. She had dreams of Selina managing it for her, but she knew they were selfish dreams. Such an excursion would make an altogether unwarranted inroad on this year's income. Selina would never consider it, but though Crystal did not admire Agnes's Juliet, she was careful not to show it. Hebe had done this for her. Hebe had helped her out of her own bitter disappointment, and later out of her critical and jealous attitude. Hebe had made her care about the production as a whole, and understand that if it was to be any good, if it was to be a whole at all, Paul must have a free hand. While Crystal was looking at the one part, that of Juliet, as being all important, Paul was concerned with the harmony of all the parts, and he must have his chance to succeed or fail on those lines. At first it had been very difficult for Crystal, watching Agnes doing exactly what she herself wanted to do most in all the world, and felt she could do so much better. But gradually the old nurse had absorbed her. Paul had been right. It was not so easy. It required hard work. She gave the work, and soon the thought of how she had lost Juliet became more and more bearable, until now it was really only the shadow of a memory. She couldn't like Agnes's Juliet. It was too thin, so she expressed it to herself, but the play as a whole had taken color and life in Paul's eager hands, and now it was the play that concerned Crystal, no single character in it. She had learned to forget herself. They had all learned to forget themselves, all who were taking part. That was the magic Paul had worked for them. But beyond Paul, Crystal had Hebe. Hebe, for her, made the self-forgetting a conscious self-forgetting, for she talked about it, and found words for it. This was what Hebe said about self-forgetting. Crystal expected to remember it all her life. No one ever becomes a great actor, Crystal, until he has attained to pursuit abnegation. He has to live for the play, not make the play live for him. That is the difference between the great and the would-be great. Well, Crystal was actually succeeding in thinking of Romeo and Juliet in terms of Shakespeare rather than in terms of Crystal now. It was a fascinating adventure after one got into it, like traveling on a white road, straight away and away and away into unknown lands. The white road caught the light in the way Hebe's mole scarf had caught the light as she went away from them yesterday, along the cliff's edge. It was the same quality of light. Thoughts like this, that so often occupied Crystal's mind, were what made her neglect to be curious and thoughtful about things more tangible. In spite of what she had said to Hilda about not knowing Madame Coldwater, this very afternoon Crystal was destined to take tea with her at Blue Diamond. The way it came about surprised Madame Coldwater herself as much as it surprised Crystal, but Madame Coldwater did not confide this until some time afterward. Crystal was walking home, alone from rehearsal as it happened. She was sauntering along at the side of the road, her hands linked behind her, a habit of hers when she was solitary and thoughtful. Madame Coldwater's car suddenly turned the corner ahead of her, passed, and came to a stop just beyond. There was certainly nothing along those fields for Madame Coldwater to stop for, and still half absorbed in her own thoughts, Crystal turned about to see what the explanation might be, a broken tire or what. As she did so, she caught Madame Coldwater's eye, for she too was turned about, looking at Cristel. She beckoned. Or had she really beckoned? Cristel could hardly believe it, but she obeyed what she hardly believed, and walked back toward the car. As she went, she tucked in the wayward lock that would escape all the invisible pins in the world and bob against her cheek. Madame Coldwater observed the motion and was grateful for it. Cristel's hair, especially that lock, had annoyed her all summer. Madame Coldwater was in her plum-colored car today, a big open French car, made to her particular order, gold monogrammed, sumptuous, its high, shining windshields giving it the look of some gigantic insect all set to fly. The chauffeur was as plum-colored as the car, in uniform and visored cap. He was standing in the road now, his hand on the crystal knob of the door. "Won't you drive with me?" Miss Coldwater asked. "We haven't been introduced, but each knows the other to be a respectable person for all that. I am going the shore road, and a companion would be grateful." It was put in the form of a question, but to Cristel it was the same as a command. It never entered her head to say that she had promised Selina to find some wild roses for the dining-room table, and that she had a dozen things she meant to do before supper anyway. Madame Coldwater was such a tradition in Fairfleet, a tradition that had only increased in her 3 years' absence, that Cristel had come to share in the general attitude toward her. If Madame Coldwater asked her to drive with her, why, that was comparable to being invited by a queen, and a tall feather in any one's cap. Heretofore, the only one in Fairfleet to wear the feather was Miss Grant. It did not matter that Cristel felt that Madame Coldwater was old as the hills, while she was young as the day, or that in the thought of an hour by her side in the glittering car loomed a terror of tongue-tiedness and dismay, with no Selina to help give the social wheels a turn. She was simply a puppet of the common mind of Fairfleet, when she managed a smile and said thank you. The chauffeur opened the door, and Cristel stepped up out of the dusty road to hobnob with royalty. But Cristel need not have worried about the social wheels. Madame Coldwater was so dexterous that when it came Cristel's turn at them, they whirred before she was conscious of touching them. Madame Coldwater began it. "My grandson speaks of you often. He is painting you, he tells me. Does that seem rather absurd to you?" "Absurd that he's painting me? No. Why should it?" "You know no reason." "No, unless you think I'm not pretty enough. But it's not only me, you know. It's Hebe. He did it for her, because he wanted to paint her, I think." "Yes, just who is this Hebe? Alexander seems very vague about her. She is your friend." "Oh, yes, my friend. It was sweet to claim her." Some way, claiming friendship with Hebe made Cristel's presence here in Madame Coldwater's car, at Madame Coldwater's side, more reasonable. If Cristel was good enough for Hebe, she was surely good enough for Madame Coldwater. She did not say this clearly to herself, or realize that the being good enough would be being good enough in two entirely different ways. What is her right name? I mean her full name. And who is she exactly, this friend of yours? I am interested naturally, because she seems to be having an influence on my grandson's work. Crystal did not blush or show any chagrin as she confessed. I don't know her full name, whether Hebe's her first or her last even, but she's called just Hebe by everyone. Hilda and Paul and Bianca and Alexander and me, and somehow you don't ask her questions about it. Yes. The tone of that yes was very peculiar, Crystal thought. She had never heard anyone say yes, as Madame Coldwater managed it. The natural response to it seemed to be to say yes herself, and she did. For an instant this annoyed Madame Coldwater, and she looked at Crystal sharply, but Crystal's gaze was waiting hers. It was still radiant, with the consciousness behind it that she and Hebe were really and truly friends. Madame Coldwater lost her irritation. So you think it's for Hebe the portrait is being painted? Doesn't that seem unlikely? Alexander says he has her turned away in the picture, just a glimpse of her cheek, and the outline of her hair against the light. She was done some while ago, but he is still working on you. Oh yes, but hasn't he told you why? He wouldn't dream of painting Hebe the way he's painting me. He says this picture is to be a true picture, and he couldn't truly paint Hebe full face. That is because she is too beautiful to be painted full face. He told us about a Chinese, a very learned Chinese he met in Pekin last summer. They were speaking of Mahjong, and the title they call the White Dragon. The Chinese said the White Dragon was represented by a plain white tile without any figure on it, because it was too beautiful to be seen or to overtake. Alexander told Hebe she was the White Dragon, and so he mustn't try to do more of her than her hair against the light and a glimpse of her cheek, because it would be absurd to pretend he could see or overtake her. This evidently surprised Madame Coldwater very much. Yes, she had said yes again, but this time Crystal did not repeat the word after her. She waited. Finally Madame Coldwater remarked, Alexander assured me she was not beautiful, this Hebe. I am a little surprised at what you tell me now. Oh, but she's not beautiful. Alexander is right. He didn't mean it that way. Or rather, he did mean it just that way. She's so beautiful, we can't see how beautiful she is. She doesn't make it evident. She's turned away, or too far ahead to be overtaken, or something like that. Don't you see? I see that you are being rather subtle, or that Alexander has been subtle for you perhaps. It is an idea I can comprehend, however, that of the White Dragon. What does Hebe say herself when Alexander gives his imagination free rein like this? Hasn't Alexander himself told you about her? I can't remember what she said. He only said it once. I think she was asleep, and didn't hear, perhaps. Asleep, really. Well, this is the sort of thing, I suppose, such crazy art as Alexander's lands one in. One of you he makes invisible, and you whom he says he is doing full face. Do you look like anything human, or has he only painted ideas down? I look myself. It's better than a photograph. Madame Coldwater started at this, and turned on Cristel. Her eagerness and her sudden pleasure were evident, and they warmed Cristel. Do you mean it? Then she smiled. Some sophisticated persons would think the comparison to a photograph not complimentary, but I am delighted. So will his father be. You really are telling me that the thing seems real. Cristel repeated that it seemed more real than a photograph. After some time of pleased silence, Madame Coldwater returned to Hebe as a subject. Everyone but you, my dear, she commented, behaves so strangely about her. Alexander is frankly evasive. Hilda and Paul are embarrassed into fidgets. Miss Grant grows vituperative. She was talking only this morning. Hebe incensed her very much by intruding on your picnic. You alone are tranquil. You are a comfortable person, I think. Cristel blushed at the compliment. I am glad you find me so, she remarked hesitantly, and then, as though she did not want to sail under false colors, added, Selina doesn't always find me comfortable. She thinks I'm very funny and queer. So that brought Selina on the stage of this conversation. Madame Coldwater learned that Selina's chief reason for finding Cristel uncomfortable was Cristel's craze for the stage. It was apparent at once that Madame Coldwater herself found this uncomfortable in Cristel. It's a wretched career to choose, the worst a girl could possibly desire, she affirmed, and in any case, I do not see that you are especially fitted for it. Agnes Grant was selected for Juliet, wasn't she, in your play? If you have talent, why wasn't it you? And then actresses, especially moving picture actresses, I understand, must be beautiful. The camera is merciless. Cristel agreed to this, but it was not a moving picture actress she wanted to be, not primarily, though, like Victoria Gildersleeve, she would probably act for the silver screen a little. She explained to Madame Coldwater that everything could be done with make-up. Why, you must know yourself that ugly people can be made to look quite beautiful, and old people young. It was out before she realized the awfulness of it. Certainly Madame Coldwater needed no instruction in these arts. She was old enough to be Alexander's grandmother, and yet, even in Cristel's present proximity to her, she looked young, almost uncannily young. Her skin was smooth and unwrinkled, tinted like a girl's, and her figure, as she leaned back against the plum-colored cushions, was slim and supple as a young woman's. Even her hands, folded on her mauve gloves, not encased in them, were firm and white and young. Madame Coldwater had heard what Cristel said perfectly and applied it to herself, but she knew that no rudeness was intended, and she was only amused. She laughed quite blithely. You have me there, she agreed. Oh no, I never meant. I only meant if I'm ugly, it doesn't matter. It can be fixed. But you are not ugly, and I was not implying that you were. But you are not striking either. Now, Selina, somehow it seemed to hurt her to say Selina's name. She lowered her voice. Selina is striking. If she had wanted to be a second Victoria Gildersleeve, what is she wanting for a career herself? Crystal pondered it. Then she replied, Dr. Grant thinks she ought to be a trained nurse. He says she'd be perfect, but she herself doesn't want to be anything. She wants to be a mother of 6 children, and order a house, and bring them up, and do good. Selina is very good. She never misses church, and she likes planning for people's comfort, and making things smooth. Selina is like Penelope. She could play Penelope perfectly. Madame Coldwater turned her head away from Crystal toward the sea. They were now on the shore road, with long stretches of woods on one side, lacy roofed and with sun-spattered floors, and the ocean on the other, the sparkling ocean of a breezy day, diamond-capped. Madame Coldwater, as they spun along, looked at the ocean, and Crystal looked into the woods. Had Madame Coldwater taken Crystal's comments on her sister as criticism? That was not to be tolerated. Crystal said earnestly, You know, Selina is perfect. She doesn't need a career. When Madame Coldwater turned to her at that, Crystal saw that there was suffering on her face. Perhaps she would not have detected it if suffering had not been so incongruous with Madame Coldwater's suave manner. Is she said. Do you think she would come to lunch with me some day, and you? Crystal was taken aback. She couldn't answer that offhand somehow, but Madame Coldwater, looking at her inquiringly, drew the truth from her. There's something about Blue Diamond that I don't know about. Selina never let me go exploring there, even while you were away. I've never been inside the gates, and at first she didn't want Alexander to paint my picture. Hebe persuaded her out of that, though, but she says she would rather Alexander didn't come to Tinkle Bell at all. She was polite to him when he did come once, but she was disturbed about it. There's a mystery. I am sure there's a mystery. Why haven't you unraveled it then? Madame Coldwater appeared not a bit surprised about the mystery. Her only wonder seemed that Crystal had let it remain one. Crystal did not know why she had not unraveled it. She could not go into explanations of her own temperament, which was so docile and lacking in curiosity, except along its own roads. She did not know about the peculiarities of that temperament herself, for in spite of being a dreamer, Crystal was not introspective to any degree. Well, I shall invite you and Selina to lunch some day soon, in any case, and perhaps we can unravel it together. I've come to believe that life is too short to encourage such mysteries. You will like Blue Diamond. Let us turn back there now and have tea. I have a wildflower garden that may interest you, and I hope it may delight you. Home, Eton." The gigantic winged insect was clever at turning, even on this narrow road between shelving rock and leaf mold. At one instant, Crystal expected to be plunged into the sea, and the next into the feathery world of the beaches. But nothing of the sort happened. They turned quickly, without mishap, and just in time for Dr. Grant's car to go by without slackening speed. Miss Grant was driving in the front seat, and Hilda and Agnes were in the back. Miss Grant bowed, and the girls waved, and Crystal had a kaleidoscopic view of surprise flashing past on three faces as they started off with Blue Diamond itself for objective now. She had a queer sense of being a child again and running toward forbidden adventure. Blue Diamond had always been denied her, as she had confided to Madame Coldwater, and then she had been excluded from the garden party invitations. Now, with all its court assembled, Crystal knew from Hilda that there was a large house party gathered there. The great house stood in the blue distance like some enchanted, forbidden place. She did not believe that Selina would really object to her going there, since Madame Coldwater herself was taking her. But Selina would be uneasy for her, as uneasy as though Crystal were going into a haunted country. This Crystal surmised, and it lent suspense to their flying advance. Chapter 15. Down the Rabbit Hole. Blue Diamond contained guest rooms for 40 people, so it had the proportions of a palace, and its estate was in keeping with the great house. There were parks, beautifully planned and kept, woodlands, gardens, lakes, and actually acres of greenhouses where flowers from every country in the world grew and prospered. They spun now almost silently up the broad drive with its leisurely sweeping curves, and came to a gentle stop under a marble portico, vine-wreathed and sun-flecked. Madame Coldwater alighted, and Crystal followed. The big door stood wide open to the summer winds and scents, and though the automobile had come so smoothly sliding up around the curves, and stopped so noiselessly, instantaneously the whole place seemed aware that its lady had returned. A liveried footman had materialized out of air, apparently to turn the crystal knob of the car's door and fold back the gossamer silk robe they had worn across their knees. A lady's maid waited just inside the hall to take Madame Coldwater's hat and veil, and to slip the short creamy lace jacket from her shoulders. Crystal heard the tall footman at her back, not the one who had appeared under the portico, but the one who seemed lord of the hall, softly say to a third footman, "See about Madame's special tea now." Madame Coldwater lightly touched Crystal's arm, and they started together. Their steps matched down the very long, and very wide hall toward the opening at its end, which was as wide and as high as the hall itself, and seemed just a huge picture frame for blue sky and dim trees. All the distance they traversed together, Madame Coldwater did not speak, and this gave Cristel opportunity for her own thoughts. She was reminded of Alice in her fall down the rabbit hole. She suspected that Alice must have floated down past those old cupboards and bookshelves and maps and pictures of the rabbit hole, much in the same mood of wonder and dream that she herself now floated past the objects in Blue Diamond's great hall. The power of gravity that supposedly drew Alice downward was substituted in Cristel's case by the light touch of Madame Coldwater's fingers on her arm, a touch so light that Cristel was only subconsciously aware of it. The objects she drifted by in this dreamy state were massive carved tables holding ornaments of bronze and silver and crystal, high-backed chairs, jars standing on the floor, looking like things out of an Arabian Nights tale, and holding tall sprays of flowers that made delicate patterns against the shadowy walls, great candelabra bearing tall wax candles as the jars bore their flowers, enormous great tapestries glowing like jewels, and gilded doorways opening into vast rooms where bright rugs made splashes of color against dark polished floors, and strange and beautiful pictures shone from the walls. And as Alice, even tumbling into Wonderland as she was, thought about commonplace home things, so Cristel thought of Tingle Bell and Selina, and wondered whether this adventure was to make her late for supper for the 4th time already this week, this being the 4th day of the week, and what Selina would say when she told her story. As they approached the open end of the hall, Cristel heard the murmur of voices, and beyond that the softer murmur of splashing water. They came out on to a high-flagged terrace above Blue Diamond itself, the lake that was really a lake, and yet only 2/3 the length of the great house. A wide, shallow flight of marble steps led down from the terrace directly into the sparkling water. The color of the water took Cristel's breath. Seen from Long Hill, it had always looked blue and sparkling enough to justify its name, but here, just above it, it was like no other blue in the world, not even larkspur blue. Cristel stood, her delight as plain as a sentence in her face. Madame Coldwater was reading that sentence in Cristel's face, and others were too, for there were a dozen or more people sitting and standing about on the terrace, drinking tea or cold punch, eating sandwiches, and chatting. All their eyes, for the instant, were on Madame Coldwater and the guest she had brought home for tea. Cristel was wearing a blue dotted muslin trimmed with narrow Irish crochet, white silk stockings, and white canvas ties. Except for her roughened, blowy hair, she was all right for this Blue Diamond tea party. It was a fortunate accident, really, that had made her neglect getting an apron this noon when the luncheon dishes were to be washed, and so spatter her brown and white gingham that a change had seemed necessary before going up to rehearsal at the Red House. She thought of this now gratefully, right on top of her delight in the blue at her feet. All the men on the terrace made a point of standing up. They were men of every size and kind. Crystal noticed there were fat men and lean men, short men and tall men, old men and young men, but they all had one thing in common, an air of unusual distinction. In fact, they were the type of men to be seen pictured in the illustrated weeklies, laying cornerstones, delivering addresses, signing treaties, and some of them were certainly foreign. The foreigners, perhaps, seemed the most distinguished of all, with their oddly trimmed beards and their very strangeness. They were dressed in white flannels or Rajah silk, and there was an ease about their immaculate clothes and the way they wore them that was new to Crystal. The women, oddly enough, all looked about the same age, but this was largely due to the prevailing fashions that made slim youth, even when one is 60, the thing to be achieved. Beautiful hats, vivid with flowers, shaded their faces, and their frocks were flower-colored. Madame Coldwater accepted the chairs that were instantly produced for herself and Crystal, with light nods to the several men who were instrumental, and included every one on the terrace in a larger nod. Then she turned to Crystal. Her attitude implying it was a tete-a-tete. She wanted with her young guest. 2 footmen came to them from the house, the first carrying a light table, the second a tray with an honest brown earthenware teapot and a tall, long-nosed bronze pitcher of hot water. They were followed by a third with 2 teacups, lemon, sugar, cream, and sandwiches and cakes. The table was set at Madame Coldwater's elbow, covered with a fragile cloth, and then the tea things in order. A footman murmured something in Crystal's ear. Though his tones were very nearly inaudible, he was precise and understandable. He wanted to know whether she would have tea or cold punch. "Oh, tea, please," she said promptly. Imagine taking anything but tea at this moment in her life. But such tea! There were jasmine petals floating in its amber surface, and it smelled like perfume. She was glad she had followed Madame Coldwater's example and taken neither cream nor lemon. This way it was a magic drink. "What are you thinking?" Madame Coldwater asked, when they were alone, drinking their tea. "Your face has been one succession of changing thoughts ever since we came out here. The first was plain enough. You liked my diamond water, but since that I have not followed. It had been more impressions than thoughts with Crystal, but wanting to answer Madame Coldwater, as Madame Coldwater apparently desired her to, she plunged for some definite memory of thought. She fished it up. "Well," she said, "coming out through the hall, I thought about Alice, how she fell down the rabbit hole. Your hall was the rabbit hole to me, and now I am through into the garden without any hunt for the key. The key, I think, would be the reason you invited me, but I'm here without it, without knowing. And there's no pool of tears. Blue Diamond isn't tears, it's laughter." Perhaps this didn't sound like thoughts. Perhaps it was too incoherent. But Madame Coldwater had followed because she knew her Alice as well as Cristel knew hers, and she liked Cristel's figure of the key. "Since you are through into the garden without the key," she said, smiling, showing her friendliness about it at all, "you don't need it, do you?" "No, but Selina, you see, has it. She must have it. So why wasn't she the one to drop down the rabbit hole instead of me?" Now that Cristel was facing Madame Coldwater directly across the tea table and looking at her face as she asked the question, she no longer had any doubt that Selina's name was a pain to her hostess, but Madame Coldwater's voice lost nothing of its friendliness. She did not blame Cristel for the pain. She said, "Yes, it appears that Selina has the key, since she feels, as you say she does, that Alexander may not visit Tingle Bell, and she has never let you explore Blue Diamond, even with me away. And I am surprised that she has not shared her knowledge with you. She must have a reason for that. I shall invite you together to luncheon soon, and we will see what her reasons are." Their tete-a-tete was interrupted after that by several people drifting up to them in a desultory way, people coming from the house who had not been there on their arrival, and so had missed the indication Madame Coldwater had given that she wanted Cristel to herself. They stood about with their teacups and tall, frosted goblets of punch, chatting in polyglot language, French, Italian, English. Even when it was English, it was mostly incomprehensible to Cristel, for it concerned affairs of which she knew nothing, foreign policy, music, art, personalities, a tangled skein for Cristel. But when her tea was finished, Madame Coldwater took Cristel away. "I will show you the wildflower garden now," she said. They walked along the terrace, past many tall open windows of the house, until they came to the end of the lake and could descend the steps onto a lawn. The wildflower garden was at the end of a narrow, wooded path at the top of a rocky grotto. There, in sunshine and shade, on even and uneven ground, grew the dozens of varieties of wild flowers that Madame Coldwater had found on walks in her own woods and transplanted there. It was bigger and fuller than Cristel's own wildflower garden, and there were some plants Cristel had never seen. Cristel was silent for some time. She was busy discovering new friends and old, but her remarks, when they began to come, were so intelligent that Madame Coldwater listened with respect. Cristel had learned her lessons from old John Hankins well, and so the way Madame Coldwater had found the right soil and the right place for each and every plant was no mystery to her. But more than this practical knowledge, her feeling about the garden as a whole was what pleased Madame Coldwater. They had chatted for some time about soils and the various requirements of light and water for the little plants. Then Cristel had looked up from where she knelt by a bank of white violets to say, "I don't believe they know they are made into a garden at all, any of them. It's as though you had brought them home to visit you as you did me, and they are liking it so much they just stay on." Madame Coldwater did not respond to this with her voice, but a glance at her face would have shown Cristel how much she responded with her mind. Cristel, however, was absorbed again over the flowers, and did not look up. Soon they returned to the house, for Cristel had looked at her wrist watch. Blue Diamond dined at 8, but Cristel and Selina supped at 6, and it was 20 minutes of 6 now. The terrace was nearly deserted. The lake had lost its blue, and lay heliotrope, a great transparent petal reflecting the tall windows of the house. Music was coming from one of those open windows, and their talk dropped as they approached it. When they reached the window, they paused and stood listening. A young man was playing on a piano at the far end of a long room. He was all alone, and though he was facing them, he did not see them. He was quite lost in his music. Madame Coldwater sat down in the deep window embrasure and became lost too. Cristel suddenly felt entirely shut out. She was utterly solitary, and she ought to be on her way home. Selina would be wondering, and besides, it had happened every day this week that she had been too late to help with supper, but she could not very well speak to Madame Coldwater to say good-bye when she was looking like that, so absorbed in the music. Nothing was left for her but to lean against the stone of the building and, looking down at the water, wait. And so standing, Cristel gradually forgot about Selina and supper and the long walk home. She too was following the music. It was César Franck's prelude, chorale, and fugue that the young man was playing, but Cristel, very ignorant of music, did not know that. She remembered the light that had caught Hebe's scarf as she walked on the cliff above the sea. The same light was in the music, only there was much more of it. It grew and grew, spreading wider and wider with the chanting of the music. Something in Cristel's consciousness expanded with the light, spread with it, and when the music ceased, that new territory in Cristel's consciousness did not fade and die away. It was hers to keep. She was not surprised to find Alexander standing at her shoulder, and to realize that he too had been listening many minutes, but for an instant she forgot Madame Coldwater, and where she was entirely. She looked up at Alexander, and said, "Now I know things I never knew before. That's where Hebe lives, where the music came from. You couldn't paint her, of course, ever, but you might play her. Music could do it." His laugh brought her back, but it was from clear thinking to the more everyday thinking that passes for clear, because ordinarily what we have to compare it with is lower in the scale rather than higher. Madame Coldwater stood up. "He began," she exclaimed. "And you think music is more coherent than painting?" Crystal nodded. She did not understand what Madame Coldwater meant exactly, but she guessed it to be the same thing she herself had meant. But then she said in her ordinary tones, "I shall have to hurry, I am afraid. Selina will be worried. Alexander will take you in his car, of course. I am glad you came to tea, Crystal." Crystal was too glad. How glad she could not say. Having been here seemed no longer a feather in her cap, though, not in the face of that music. And it did not matter now one bit whether Agnes ever knew that she had taken tea at Blue Diamond or not. Crystal did not want envy. She had no more use for feathers in caps. Such feathers were too silly for thought. But something was troubling her. Madame Coldwater put her finger on it at once, without Crystal's saying a word, though. She reassured her lightly. "When Selina knows that I brought you here with me myself, and that it was I who sent Alexander back with you, she won't mind about that. So run along, both of you." The conversation had been almost in whispers as they stood withdrawn from the window and beyond the vision of the pianist. Now he began to play again. This time it was Debussy. Madame Coldwater hurried Alexander and Crystal away before the music should lay its hands on them again. And besides, she wanted no commoner touch than the chorale and fugue to shade the expression in Crystal's clear eyes just then. Alexander seemed delighted to obey his grandmother, and he took Crystal away with him through many rooms until they struck the big hall that always to Crystal would be the rabbit hole. Odd name for such a magnificent apartment, but he did not telephone the garage or have a footman do so. He took Crystal by diverse paths and finally through a crack in a hedge to the automobile stables, as he called them. There they got into his car, a low-hung roadster, beautiful and swift, and backing out were off in a flash toward Fairfleet and Tingle Bell. As they went, Crystal asked him, as she had promised Hilda she would, about painting the sets for their production of Romeo and Juliet. Rather to her surprise, he consented, and even consented with eagerness. "Now that the picture's done, I have nothing on my hands for 2 weeks," he said. "Not till I sail." "Oh, is the picture done? Really? And are you going abroad?" "Yes, I finished it this morning without you. You're as clear as that in my mind now, and I'm going to meet my father and mother in Switzerland for some climbing before father takes up my painting education in the fall in Florence. So it'll be fun playing with you kids at the Red House and messing around with your affairs. I've got an idea about the street scene. I was going to propose myself doing something about it. I'll look you up there early tomorrow. Before they came to a sliding stop at Tingle Bell's door, Alexander inquired, "How did you happen to be at Blue Diamond?" "I'd asked grandmother to invite you before, and she half promised, but I never thought she would do it without telling me. I'd have come earlier if I'd known. As it was, I might have missed you." "It was accidental, her asking me," Crystal informed him. "It just happened as she was passing in her car. She wanted company." He looked at Crystal puzzled. His grandmother's attitude, whenever he had mentioned Crystal Barker's name, had been full of strain and unspoken displeasure. He had not been able to understand it at all, but now he could, even less, understand her having picked Crystal up casually for company. Madame Coldwater was ordinarily as far from casual in her social relations as the North Pole is, proverbially, far from the South. But he could not hope for an explanation from Crystal. One not unlikely occurred to his own mind, however, and he asked quickly, "Did you talk a lot about Hebe to her? Did she ask you a lot?" "Not a lot. Why?" "Oh, well, she's frightfully keen, my grandmother. She'd see everything instantaneously, given a chance. Don't talk to her about Hebe if you can help it. I never do. A word might convince her." "Convince her of what?" Alexander reddened, but he laughed too. "Oh, that she ought to invite her to tea, possibly. And Hebe would be bored by that, wouldn't she?" "I don't think so. Hebe would like your grandmother, and she would love the wildflower garden." But Crystal felt that there was more meaning in Alexander's words than she could fathom, and that he was concerned in some way for Hebe. If he had wanted her, Crystal, invited for tea, why wouldn't he want Hebe? Then Crystal remembered that Hebe was Bianca's, a housekeeper's visitor and friend, and knew it would never enter Madame Coldwater's head to ask her to Blue Diamond. Still, Alexander seemed actually to be dreading such an invitation for her. Well, Alexander was Hebe's admirer as much as Crystal was, and her friend. Whatever he meant, it was not disloyal, so no need to bother. With Hilda it was different. Crystal was not exactly sure whether Hilda really cared for Hebe or not. How could she be so sure after what Hilda had said this very day about Hebe's keeping out of the play altogether, being better for Paul? No, Crystal was no longer sure about Hilda's quality as an ally, but she was sure of Alexander's absolutely. Everything that had happened and everything that had been said on the View in the long hours while he was painting them, justified Crystal in her conviction that Alexander, from the very first, had taken Hebe's wonderfulness for granted. So, though she wondered at him now, she was not perturbed. Chapter 16. Off to Blue Diamond. The next days were crowded ones for the cast and everyone who had anything to do with the coming production. Mr. Gildersleeve had found that he could spare only one night to his children and the Red House, and that must be the night of the 11th. Paul had counted on a week more than that to get the play ready, but there was no help for it. Of course, his father must see the performance. Paul had been looking forward to this opportunity of showing his father what he could do all along. By rushing everyone and everything, it could be managed, and things done in a rush like that are often the most successful of all, Paul was aware. Besides, it is very stimulating to work under pressure. They all felt it so. Miss Grant whirled away with her committee to Boston and returned still whirling, bearing yards and yards of rich velvets and subtle silks. There was a box of theatrical jewels, too, and many props. Alexander Coldwater painted scenery vigorously, and was often called in by the costume committee to pass on designs and colors. All unasked, he did a charming little watercolor to express his idea of how Juliet should look in her ball gown, with her hair filleted and cascading in curls. Paul and Miss Grant accepted it whole, and decreed that Agnes should be made as perfect a replica as possible. Hilda worked with hammer and saw and all a carpenter's tools, and a stalwart company of boy mechanics helped her. For the laying of the water curtain pipe, she had more expert assistants, however. A plumber came up from Cummington with 2 assistants. If the mothers of the cast had been allowed to go ahead now and make their sons and daughters costumes, all would have been simple enough. But this Paul would not listen to. The costume committee, and as many hired seamstresses as could be procured, must meet to sew at the Red House, where everything would be under his and Miss Grant's supervision. Much of the work, of necessity, must be experimental at first, for not until colors and line were actually seen on the stage, in ensemble, could he be sure they were right. Besides, keeping only a few busied with costumes secured a fresher effect for the audience on the night of the play. If all Fairfleet was to have costumes in various stages of manufacture under its eyes during this week, it certainly would take the edge from the performance itself. 3 seamstresses were secured, 2 from Cummington and Miss Baxter, Fairfleet's one and only. 3 sewing machines were lent, and the upper chambers of the Red House took on the appearance of lofts in a sweatshop. During the last few days, Bianca Falgana, that dark and somber person, gave most of the cooking into the charge of the amiable Rose, and herself came into the sewing rooms to lend her almost supernaturally skillful hands to building costume creations. Her fingers were truly magical and swift as light, and in her silent, strange way she appeared to be as interested as anyone in the success of the undertaking. This surprised and delighted Miss Grant. In Bianca she found a partner she sorely needed. They worked shoulder to shoulder with all their might, to all appearances steeped in mutual respect. It was only natural, under these circumstances, that Miss Grant should mention Hebe to Bianca, and ask if she might not be pressed into service. Time was short, and an extra pair of hands would be a blessing in the sewing rooms. But at the first mention of her friend's name, Bianca's English became almost incoherent, and the blank expression on her somber face indicated that she could not understand 1/10 of Miss Grant's arguments, and certainly none of her insinuations. She understood just enough, however, to shake her head with a very definite negation, and say, "He rest, she rest." Miss Grant was irritated. Sometimes she felt that Hebe's whole design in visiting Fairfleet this summer had been to annoy and puzzle her. This, however, was the last straw. Here they all were, working like Trojans, wrapped in the fun and the challenge of the really big undertaking of putting on Romeo and Juliet in a worthy way, and Hebe would not lift a finger. She wasn't even helping in the kitchen in Bianca's absence. So far as Miss Grant could discover, she was merely idling, resting, and Miss Grant was not the only one to criticize Hebe for her lack of interest. The seamstresses and the one or two mothers who now were allowed to help in the stress of the hurry murmured about Bianca's selfish visitor too. They had seen her pass sometimes, like a shadow, through the upper halls, casual and indifferent. They thought that her spirit of withdrawal contrasted very unfavorably with her friend Bianca's helpfulness, and they said so, not taking too great pains to keep their words from Bianca herself. But if Bianca understood, they never knew. The expression did not change in her somber eyes, and the speed of her marvel-working fingers was not slacked for an instant. Gossip began to grow. It was not all concerned with Hebe's refusal to help with the costumes. Nina, the discontented maid, whom Crystal had encountered that day in the servants' wing, when she was in search of Hebe, had been talking to other maids in Fairfleet. Gradually, her information had sifted through to the mistresses and became general knowledge. The amazing story went that Hebe had supper with Hilda and Paul every evening. This seemed hardly credible, but Fairfleet had to believe it finally, for one of the mothers, stopping in at the Red House on an errand just before her own dinner hour on an evening, verified it. She reported that hearing voices around at the side of the house and recognized Hilda's. She did not bother to ring, but went around. There, at the edge of the apple orchard, beyond the lawn, was a little round table set, and the two Gildersleeve young people with Hebe were having supper. No, Hebe was not waiting on them. She was sitting with them. As the visitor came up, she was, in fact, doling raspberries out of a bowl and adding cream to each helping, more like a mother at the table than a guest. Hilda was the only one of the three who showed any embarrassment when they looked up and saw the visitor. Paul and Hebe were perfectly at ease in the situation. Miss Grant, after hearing this, asked Hilda directly whether Hebe usually joined them at supper and why she forsook her friend Bianca for that meal. Hilda replied that yes, Hebe did ordinarily have supper with them out of doors, there at the edge of the orchard. Bianca preferred to dine later, really dine. Hebe, however, was hungry by 7 and did not want to wait. Miss Grant gathered from Hilda's explanation that Bianca was a little too good for her job, that she had worked so long in very great houses that in some ways she was spoiled. But Miss Grant, in her own mind, refused to put the blame for these strange procedures at the Red House on Bianca. From the very first, she had mistrusted Hebe. She wanted to protect the Gildersleeve children from a crafty and unscrupulous personality, but whenever she tried, she seemed thwarted by the Gildersleeve children themselves. They weren't like Crystal about Hebe. They did not sing her praises or talk about her at all. They appeared to ignore her, never even to think about her until Miss Grant bothered them with the topic. On the other hand, they were uneasy whenever Miss Grant or anyone else criticized her. It was probably their own dignity that concerned them in the matter. Hebe was, of course, imposing on their good nature in the absence of their mother, and they must know it. At the same time, they resented its being pointed out to them. Well, Miss Grant could understand all that. She considered herself a very understanding person where young people were concerned, and she was in some ways. Gradually, she came to the decision that she owed it to her own sense of justice and responsibility to write directly to Victoria Gildersleeve herself, telling about this visitor of her housekeepers in detail, in case Hilda and Paul had brushed it by in their own correspondence too casually. Her real respect for Bianca Folgana was all that was holding her back from this action now. Bianca Folgana, she was beginning to believe, was an extraordinarily trustworthy woman. But if this was so, why Hebe? Crystal was seeing nothing of Hebe. She was as careful as Hilda and Paul and the other young people not to go near the garden house or that long, dim passage upstairs. If Hebe wanted to see her, she herself would bring it about. That day, when she had gone to her of her own accord, after failing so in the trials, had been the one exception. They had never discussed together whether this should or should not be the way of things between them, but without words Crystal had accepted it as the only way from the very first. For all that, and in spite of the turmoil of these last days of preparation and rehearsing, Crystal missed Hebe badly, and she was always on the lookout for her while at the Red House, and in her walks to and from it, which she invariably took now across the fields, though it was really the longer way. She had never met Hebe in the road, and sometimes she had in the fields, or meadows, or woods, or hills, were the places, surely, where Hebe was to be happened upon, if such happening was to be. Crystal's part, that of the nurse, was going very well. Paul was delighted. He literally rubbed his hands over it. "If father likes nothing else," he exclaimed once in his exuberance, "he'll like you, Barker." He invariably called his actors by their last names now. Crystal paled. "Oh, do you think so, truly?" She reported this to Selina, and Selina, although she did not pale, was moved. "I shouldn't wonder one bit," Selina answered, "if he did see that you have real talent, and if he does see it, and will only remember it, he may help you later." This inspired Crystal. From then on, she took the part to her heart, and worked with it until it became a thing almost of perfection. She forgot that she had ever wanted to be Juliet, that lovely person. Instead, she gave herself completely to the mind of the garrulous old nurse. To be the ludicrous creature in her entirety at the actual minutes of acting was Crystal's one great ambition, and she was succeeding. She knew, and Selina knew, and Paul knew, and the other actors knew that she was succeeding. She wished with all her heart that Hebe knew it too, for Hebe had given her the chance. It was a gift from Hebe, and without Hebe it would never have been. But Hebe had been so queer about keeping herself free from any part in this production that Crystal doubted whether she would even be present at the performance. Crystal had just returned from rehearsal. She and Selina were to lunch with Madame Coldwater today. Crystal had quite forgotten the invitation that had come yesterday, but Selina had not forgotten. "Did you really think you were coming home to lunch?" Selina asked now, in real dismay at Crystal's absurd exclamations of surprise at finding her dressed in party clothes and sitting in the parlor instead of cooking in the kitchen. "Why, Crystal Barker, how can you be so thoughtless? Suppose you had been late getting here." "But I'm not late, am I?" Crystal asked anxiously. She had no idea of the time. When the rehearsal had broken up for lunch and the actors had all gone home, Crystal had automatically followed the others. Fortunately, the invitation was for 2:00, and it was not yet 1. Madame Coldwater was sending a car for them. Her secretary had called on the telephone to say so. It was very acceptable, for it was raining. "I've got to get back to the Red House before 4, Crystal informed her sister. "Miss Grant has my costume ready, and Agnes and I are going through our scenes again alone. That will be all right. We won't be staying at Blue Diamond as long as that. Did you tell Miss Grant we had been invited, Crystal?" No, Crystal had not told Miss Grant, since she had been so completely absorbed with rehearsing that she herself had forgotten all about the engagement. "I feel rather horrid about Miss Grant," Selina confessed now. "I haven't said a word to her about Alexander's painting you, or your having tea there, or our going today. I haven't wanted to, somehow. Oh, Crystal, you can't know how I'm feeling, and how I have been feeling. I am so all alone with it. You'll learn today, for Miss Coldwater probably means to tell you. All that conversation you and she had about the key, you know. You both agreed that I had it, and she said she'd learn the reason I hadn't told you about it. So she herself will tell you. I haven't been able to, but I am worried and half ill." Crystal looked at Selina amazed. Selina worried and half sick, and saying so. Well, she certainly didn't look it. Selina had never looked more beautiful or healthy in her life. Her eyes were very, very bright and glowing. Her cheeks were more golden in their bloom than ever, and she was dressed in her very most becoming frock, pale green muslin with a narrow yellow sash at the low waist line. Her party hat, the white leghorn with its wreath of green leaves and marigolds around the brim, was lying in readiness on the hall table beneath the mirror. "Oh, Selina, I am sorry. Are you really sick? You look splendid." Selina laughed nervously. "No, I am not ill, not really. Only tremulous and queer, Crystal. I feel the way you so often act." Now Crystal understood her better. Selina was excited, and Selina excited was Selina abnormal. They both laughed. Then Selina said seriously, "I do wish your friend Hebe was here this minute, though. She could calm me. You know I told her about Madame Coldwater, the things I haven't told you. She was wonderful about it. She said such wonderful things. I wish she were here now. I wish she were going with us." This certainly was a most surprising Selina. Crystal sighed, a mixed sigh, if there can be such a thing, of pleasure and sadness. "Oh, Selina," she said, "it is such a comfort your saying such things about Hebe. Everyone else is saying such horrid things now. They make me furious." But Crystal did not look furious, or indeed as though she had strength for fury. She looked, in the shaded light of the parlor, like a very tired little girl. There were delicate shadows under her eyes. Her cheeks appeared to have grown thin overnight, and her lips were sharply etched and pale in her pale face. She sat on the fire bench, leaning languidly against a convenient chair back, Selina was troubled by her. "You look tired to death, my dear," she said. "I don't think you ought to go back there at 4, but come home and rest instead. Indeed, I think you must come back and rest." "Oh no, I can't do that, and I don't feel a bit tired. What gives you such an idea? I'm too excited to be tired, only I do wish we weren't going to lunch with Madame Coldwater. That does seem a task." The expression this sentiment brought to her sister's face drew Crystal up short. Going to lunch at Blue Diamond today had been the thing Selina had been living toward since yesterday when the invitation came. Crystal, in her absorption in her own interest, was certainly being selfish. Why, if Selina had said going to Romeo and Juliet would be a bore, it wouldn't be more selfish. Crystal saw this and jumped up, color now dyeing her lips and cheeks. "Of course I don't mean it," she denied her own statement. "Of course it's just too lovely to be going, and you look grand glorious. What shall I wear?" "Your blue dotted muslin, I should think. It's the prettiest." "Yes, but I was wearing that the day I was there, remember." "Well, there's no choice but that or your Sunday muslin. I don't think I'd wear the Sunday one. She's seen that in church this summer every time she's been. And besides, it isn't Sunday." Selina was old-fashioned and quaint about some things, but so was Crystal, and she did not smile. "No, it isn't Sunday," she agreed seriously, "and there's no use pretending, is there? I've just got those two. Your hat will change the impression of the blue dotted muslin," Selina agreed. "She probably won't remember it anyway. But it's raining. We ought not to wear our leghorns. The rain won't matter to us in the auto. It will certainly be a closed one, and of course we must wear our leghorns. It's a blessing we have them." Crystal's hat was like her sister's, except that its wreath was more varied. There were cornflowers, daisies, buttercups, and feathery grasses in the wreath. She did her hair with particular attention and prayed that it would stay. The effect of the wreath and the demure smoothness of her hair was to make her look younger than 16. In fact, surveying herself in her mirror, she remarked to the image, "Infant." Well, she was going out to a lunch with Selina, and she was bound to feel young in the company of her poised and beautiful sister. She might as well look it. But Selina abounded in the unexpected today, in the closed car that conveyed them, superior to rain and mud, to Blue Diamond. Selina took Crystal's hand and held it. "Crystal, I don't know how I am going to do it," she confided. "I thought I never should speak to her in all my life, and here we are, going to lunch. I feel about 10 years old. Stay close to me and help me." Crystal was aghast. This certainly turned everything topsy-turvy. The idea of taking care of Selina was absurd. Why, Selina had always taken care of her, but Crystal rose to it as best she could. She turned her palm so that she held Selina's hand now instead of Selina holding hers, and she looked very grave and calm. "It'll be all right," she said soothingly. "Only it's too funny, my not knowing what it's all about." "You'll know soon enough, now, I imagine," Selina replied to that.